When you look at sales teams today in 2024, like what are the biggest skill gaps that you see? Because I mean, I think sales has obviously gone through this big transition right over the last couple of years, and there was the whole run up during ZERP in
Hmm.
2021, and I do think like sales teams like lost a little bit of their skills in kind of when it was easy to sell, and today there's a huge pressure on sales teams to deliver more with less. And so, like, yeah, what are those big skill gaps that you're seeing out of most sales teams today?
Yeah, two big ones that come up a lot. First and foremost is being able to sell through your champion, all right, or being able to sell through who might actually be the decision maker, but not necessarily the economic buyer, right? I mean, we all know that most purchasing decisions right now are going to be made by committee, right? And for instance, taking sales assembly, we sell the VPs of sales and CROs. And in some cases, those individuals are going to be both the decision maker and the economic buyer. In a lot of cases, they're not, right? Economic buyer is going to be the CFO that we're never going to even have the opportunity to get on a call with, right? So it's about having sort of two different conversations at the same time and prepping our champion, the decision maker in this case, the VP of sales and CRO, to sell sales assembly when we're not in the room to do so, and do so in a way where we're still speaking to the needs and the pain points of our champion, but at the same time speaking to the larger business case that the CFO is going to need to justify in order to approve spend on this. So that type of sales approach, and if you want to consider it a type of multi-threading, you can, but I think it's about more selling through the decision maker. That's something that we see a lot of reps struggling with. Another thing that we see a good amount of reps struggling with, and you sort of alluded to it a few moments ago, as far as 2021 versus now, or even taking a step a few years back to pre-COVID versus now, we're seeing that more and more organizations are finding value in getting their sales teams meeting the prospects in person. But at the same time, what we're seeing is that the sales reps have no experience doing things in person, right? And therefore, they're not equipped for it. I mean, there's a story that we heard earlier this year from one of our member companies that will forever stick with me. They were making a big push for their AEs and their CSMs to travel, get on site with their clients, build relationships in person. They weren't getting a whole lot of adoption, even though they're throwing a lot of budget and incentives and all that good stuff in order to try to push these folks to do so. And at first they thought like, okay, well, maybe our team is worried about work-life balance. They don't want to travel too much, all those standard things. But once they really drilled a little bit deeper, they found out that there is just all of this anxiety amongst the ICs about just the idea of going out and trying to meet people in person. Like, you want me to sit down at a dinner for 90 minutes with like 3 or 4 people I've never met before? I mean, no, I do 25-minute Zoom conversations, right? And the not knowing that if you're going on site to a client meeting and the meeting's at 10 o'clock at the client's office and you pull up Uber, don't arrive at 9:55, right? You got to arrive like 20, 25 minutes early because there might be security. You got to check in. You got to get it up to the office, be a few minutes early. As weird as it might sound to people like you and me that have been selling for a long time, when you think of sales reps that started their careers SDRs or BDRs in 2018, 2019, and then started selling all throughout being AEs in 2020 up until now, they never had to do this kind of stuff in person, right? So it's like asking you to play a game of basketball, to use that as an analogy before, when you've never picked up a ball before. I mean, you're not going to be that great at it. And if we put you on the court against a whole lot of, college players that have been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years, you're not going to fare that well. There's going to be a whole lot of anxiety about even stepping onto that court. So we have seen, as weird as it might sound, a pretty big gap there that a lot of organizations are looking to fill.
So interesting. And I'm definitely out of practice of it too. The in-person meeting. I mean, when I first moved to San Francisco, that's all I did. I would go down to Google and I was a consultant for them, and I would spend all day in meetings and talking to customers and working on different projects and trying to sell and all these different things. And yeah, I mean, now we've just all spent so much time like from the comfort behind our computer. And it's like, yeah, there is like that anxiety that I still honestly have, where I'm like, oh God, okay, in person, this means a little bit different. And I guess we're actually making the same push. It's funny, I was laughing as you're talking. Like, we want to go do more roadshows, lunch and learns, both with our customers and prospects. Besides like the logistics of, I totally agree with you. You got to show up early and be prepared and like dress a little nicer, maybe show up with, some pastries or something. Like, what does it take to like command a room? When you're in the room with the prospect, like, what makes that meeting different than when you're, doing a Zoom meeting? Like, do you have any advice for sellers or CSMs?
Yeah, if I could recommend that they hone in and try to improve on one skill, it would be storytelling, right? When you talk about commanding a room, whoever is going to be the best storyteller in that room, he or she, they're going to have the greatest opportunity to command the attention in that room. I think that the storytelling just in general and I like that you made that point, for either AEs or CSMs, just is critical for post-sales teams as well, to be upskilled on a lot of these competencies that might seem to them kind of salesy, but are going to be effective, especially as organizations are asking their CSMs to become more commercially minded, right? Or just think of how they engage with their clients in that way. Definitely improving their storytelling and public speaking abilities would be at the very top of the list.
And so is that just, all right, the confidence to not just, and like, I guess it's maybe, is it a combination of confidence and then not getting in the weeds around the tactics of why ever you're there, but it's more about like the why this matters? Is that sort of what you mean by the storytelling, and painting the picture of, okay, why whatever you're trying to sell like actually matters and going to make an impact on the organization? Is that kind of the way to think about it?
Yeah, that's part of the way. I think that, like a lot of other things in life, confidence will come through experience, right? Because you'd build up the muscle memory. I think that it is more about, okay, here's how you effectively structure a story, right? Because, it sounds easy intuitively, like, okay, go in and tell a story. But in order to tell an effective story, that there are some components of how you structure, how you deliver that story, right? That's going to make it more effective. So really honing in on, if you want to consider, the science of storytelling, what captures people's attention, how you could position yourself as just a magnetic human being while telling the story, so that people want to engage, they want to listen with you. Be really honing in on that kind of stuff outside of just building the confidence, which again would come through experience.
And going back to the first skill gap you mentioned, like selling through a champion, when you're doing trainings talking about that topic, like, how do people actually get better at that? Like, what are the tactics or things that you can do to better sell through a champion?
Yeah, two big things come to mind. Number one, it is understanding, again, the concept of value articulation, how to articulate value to two different audiences with two different motivations, two different sets of priorities, right? So being able to develop talk tracks, again, for two, if not more, different audiences. The other skill set, and I love what people like Jen Allen and Nate Nasrallah are evangelizing around this topic, is writing, right? How do you become a more effective and simultaneously eloquent but succinct writer, right? How can you put together, how can you arm your champion with a business case that a CFO is actually going to read, right? One of the things that we did maybe about a year ago is we sent out a survey to the CFOs of all the companies that we work with. And we just asked them a series of like 7 or 8 questions, like, hey, how do y'all buy stuff? Right. And we were able to capture some really good data. And again, regardless of the size of the company or, industry vertical, whatever the case may be, all the CFOs pretty much said the exact same thing, which is, if they're going to look at something when making a purchasing decision, they don't want it to be more than 1 or 2 pages max, right? That they don't want detail on like, hey, here's all the features and functionality. They just want to say like, hey, how is this going to drive more revenue or reduce risk within the organization at a grand strategic level, not just within this team, but at the larger company level, right? So being able to deliver that message to the CFO through your champion, when your champion may want to see, well, no, tell me more about the features and like how this is going to impact just my team and, the ROI versus the cost of inaction. That right there is a skill set that does need to be developed and honed in this day and age. Just that concept of being able to write for different audiences.
And the other thing I will add to that is, Joey, who's our head of sales, like he hits something he really preaches is like the calls between the calls. Like you have your standard intro and your demo call, and like you have these big moments, but where the deal is really won is like these little prep calls with your champion. And on those calls, you can ask the real questions that actually get to the real pain. And then that's where you can get the information to actually build the business case that's eventually going to get to the CFO. And like, that's something that he is like constantly preaching to our sales team is, okay, like what's our next step? When are we getting on a prep call with them? Talk about it. Like, how do we kind of angle our solution to them? And I think that's something like I've learned so much about sales just from watching him do that. Cause like, I don't know, the way I was trying to work with champions before was just through those big calls. And I don't think I did a good enough job of like, okay, really buddying up to them to kind of, turn them into a true champion.
Yeah, that was a big learning for us over the past year as well. Because again, in the ZERP area, any VP of sales, CRO, he or she'd be like, yeah, sure, sales, yeah, send it my way. I own the P&L, I own the budget. Like, sure, we'll get it set up. But then coming to the realization post SVB collapse, if we want to call that the tipping point, that every purchasing decision that's going to be made is going to be made when I'm not in the room. Right. Just always keeping that in mind, where you mentioned that the calls between the calls, I would go a step further and say the conversations between the calls, right. That are only happening internally that you're not privy to. You're only getting a heads up afterwards. Right. How can you put yourself in the best position to make sure that those conversations between the calls are going to position you in the best way to make that sale?